Okay, we talked about in the last video what I would call Nietzsche's diagnosis of the utter hypocrisy of modern atheism. And the utter hypocrisy is twofold. We still have another part of that to talk about, but it really is twofold in the sense that it's a hypocrisy because it still believes or values the truth, and secondly, it still has Christian values, particularly the values of concern for victims, the oppressed, the poor, the orphan, the widow, etc., the persecuted, the victimized. We'll come to that later, but I want to talk about just briefly now some parts of your text where Nietzsche talks about this. He says, anyone who is truthful in that bold and ultimate sense presupposed by faith in science thereby affirms a world other than that of life, nature, and history. And insofar as he affirms this other world, must he not precisely thereby deny its counterpart, this world, our world? In other words, it's still a metaphysical faith, Nietzsche says, on which our faith in science rests. Even we knowing ones of today's, we godless ones, we anti-metaphysicians still take our fire from the flame ignited by 1,000 years old, that of Christian faith, that was also Plato's faith, that God is truth, that truth is divine, and therefore science henceforth stands in need of justification, which is not to say that it has one. Two things about this. Nietzsche thinks that insofar as you think you're reading off the intelligibility of this world, and I know you might think this has nothing to do with ethics, but it does. Insofar as you think you're reading off the intelligibility of this world, you're still taking flight to another world, to a Platonic realm of forms. If you remember from maybe your intro to philosophy class, Plato believed in another metaphysical world of ideas. And Nietzsche famously said that Christianity is merely Platonism for the masses, or Platonism for idiots, if you want to put it more crudely. Okay? So Nietzsche thinks science, atheists need to come to terms with a self-critique of science, the very thing that leads to their atheism often. Nietzsche continues, this is in 324, the Genealogy, these modern-day naysayers, those who are unconditional on a single point, the claim to intellectual cleanliness, means atheism here, these hard, strict, abstinent, heroic spirits who constitute the honor of our age, all these pale atheists, anti-Christians, immoralists, nihilists, these skeptics, effectics, hectics of spirit, for this is one For this they are one and all in some sense. The last idealists of knowledge, these last idealists of knowledge in whom alone intellectual conscience today dwells and is embodied, they in fact believe themselves to be free as possible of the ascetic ideal. It's another word for Christianity. We'll talk about that. These free, very free spirits, yet to intimate to them what they themselves cannot see, for they're standing too close to themselves. This ideal, Christianity, is precisely their ideal. We could say the ideal of the truth. Two, they themselves represent it, and perhaps no one else. They themselves are its most spiritualized product, its most advanced warriors and scouts, its most captious, most delicate, most elusive form of seduction. If I am any kind of guesser of riddles, let me try with this proposition. They are far from being free spirits, these atheists, for they still believe in truth. They still believe in truth. Again, Nietzsche continues on the Genealogy 24. Just look at the most ancient, most recent philosophers. In none of them is there any awareness of the extent to which the will to truth, or the desire for truth itself, stands in need of a justification. There is a gap here in every philosophy. Why is that? Because the ascetic ideal, Christianity, the will to truth, whatever you want to call it, has hitherto dominated all of philosophy. Because truth was posited as being, as God, as the highest authority. Because truth was simply not allowed to be a problem. From the moment faith in the God of the ascetic ideal is repudiated, there is a new problem as well, that of the value of truth. The will to truth stands in need of a critique. Here we define our task. The value of truth must be experimentally called into question. Okay? Nietzsche is saying here that we assume that truth is an absolute value and authority in and of itself. We assume that our motives for truth are good in and of itself, but also we assume that we can find the truth, or our body or our intellect, rather, or our mind or our rationality is something that's interested in truth. We're not interested in truth. We're interested in power, and we need to come to terms with that and come to terms with the absurdity that this leads to. Okay? Nietzsche continues, just a couple more quotes from other parts. This one comes from Beyond Good and Evil, section 4. Or paragraph 4 rather. The falseness of a judgment, Nietzsche says, is not necessarily an objection to a judgment. In other words, the question is to what extent it is life-promoting, life-preserving, species-preserving, perhaps even species-cultivating. And we're fundamentally inclined to claim that the falsest judgments are the most indispensable for us, that without accepting the fictions of logic, Note this: the fictions of logic, without measuring reality against the purely invented world of the unconditional and self-identical, without a constant falsification of the world by means of numbers, man could not live. The renouncing of false judgment would mean renouncing life itself. So in other words, Nietzsche thinks we come up with these fictions to stabilize a world. We're in a world that's chaotic, and the intellect stabilizes it, and in turn falsifies it when it stabilizes it. But that's what something like being is. And of course, being and truth go together, because what's truth? Pilate asked Jesus this: what's truth? Truth is what is, right? If I say something is true, I'm saying it is the case. It is the case, right? I am sitting here right now. Is that true? Yes. Why? Because it is. And Nietzsche thinks that the intellect falsifies reality by creating this idea or constructing this idea of being. So you hear people say this all the time. Well, it's a societal construct. Society constructs things. Absolutely. And that goes all the way down for Nietzsche. Society constructs the very idea of logical categories and intelligibility itself. And when I say society, he means will to power. Life does this so as to survive. Everything is ordered to survival, to power, to the enhancement of life. Just a couple more quotes from Nietzsche's Will to Power text, which is published posthumously, and it's a collection from some of his notebooks. Nietzsche says, the criterion of truth resides in the enhancement of the feeling of power, and therefore truth is a kind of error without which a certain species could not live. The value for life is ultimately decisive. Nietzsche writes, the transformation of nature into concepts for the purpose of mastering nature, like we saw with Descartes. Ultimately, we find in things nothing but what we ourselves have imported into them. This finding is called science. Nietzsche writes, I'll say it again, ultimately man finds in things nothing but what he himself has imported into them. This finding is called science. If you're familiar with a physicist from the 20th century, the name was taken by the guy in Breaking Bad, Heisenberg. He wrote a book called Philosophy and Physics, and in there he says something like that what we find in the world is what we ourselves put into it. That we're starting to realize this in science, that our conceptual framework for understanding the world is simply inadequate to actually describe the world. Now, Heisenberg still believed that the world had a sort of intelligibility to it, but he doesn't think we can know it. He thinks our mind, our categories in physics are still Newtonian. They still deal with cause, effect, substance, things that don't change, objects. And we're finding out in the quantum world that is not the case. So we're actually imposing and finding in nature what we ourselves put there. And Nietzsche anticipated him in this. Nietzsche, of course, is a perspectivalist. He says there are no truths, only perspectives. And he says, therefore, the world in which we are concerned is false. It's not a fact, but a fable. It is in flux, as something always in the state of becoming or of change, as a falsehood, always changing but never getting near truth. For there is no truth, he says. We call it explanation, but it's description, which distinguishes us from earlier stages of knowledge in science. We describe better. We explain just as little as any who came before us. In other words, we don't know anything about the world. We're getting better at describing it so as to control it. And of course, there is no truth for Nietzsche. So this is just a digression into Nietzsche's philosophy of science, but it has radical implications on the way he conceives of morality and ethics, but also the way he conceives of postmodernity or atheism and relativism as it stands today in our culture, in our society. He thinks he's critical of everybody, Nietzsche. He's critical of Christianity. He thinks Christianity is ridiculous. But he's almost even more critical of atheism in a certain sense, because he thinks it's still just another form of Christianity, that we haven't, Christianity and its values, truth and concern for victims, these are stains that won't come out for Nietzsche. They won't go away. And people may say, I don't believe in God. And they'll say, well, do you think, and Nietzsche would say, well, do you think the world is ordered and intelligible? Well, yeah, of course. Then you're still a Christian in practice for Nietzsche. Or Nietzsche will say, you don't believe in God? Do you think you should care about oppressed people and victims? And the person will go, well, yeah, of course. What are you talking about? Then you're still a Christian because you don't realize that's a Christian value. Okay? This is just the beginning of what I think is very important as we read Nietzsche. Understand how deep his critique of religion goes, or how deep his critique of Christianity goes, because the essay, the Genealogy of Morals, the three essays are really a masterful critique of Western culture. And Nietzsche, remember, says Western culture is Judeo-Christian. And so in order to critique Western culture, in order to figure out its conditions for possibility, the various forms of will to power behind it, you have to go at Christianity. And that's what we're going to start with when we start going deeper into the first essay.